Hello, and welcome to today's lecture on the Aeneid. I'm your professor, Dr. Rob Steffen, and today we are going to talk about the hero Aeneas' journey from Troy to the Italian shores and his military victories once he gets there. But the Aeneid isn't just an adventure story. It actually legitimizes an entire political regime. More than that, it puts Roman literature right up there next to the Greeks in terms of quality. So whether you're looking to fulfill your destiny, or would prefer to settle down with lovely Queen Dido, journey with me as we investigate the Aeneid, epic of ancient Rome.
At the height of the Roman Empire, Rome had a problem. It was the most dominant power in the Mediterranean. It had defeated the Carthaginians, the Gauls, and the Greeks. But as it looks at the legacy of the lands it conquered, especially that of the Greeks, it couldn't help but feel inferior. When it came to military strength, it was unparalleled. But when it came to art and literature and drama, it was a distant second to Greece.
And so the first emperor Augustus, ruling in the 1st century BCE and the 1st century CE, goes about trying to put together a cultural program to legitimize the Roman Empire, his place in it, and even compete with the cultural sophistication of the Greeks hundreds of years previously. And to do this, he hires the poet Publius Virgilius Maro, who we'll call Virgil, to create an epic so grand in scale and so powerful in quality that it can actually rival the Iliad and the Odyssey of the Greeks, written 700 years earlier.
Virgil was born in the far north of Italy around 70 BCE, and while his family wasn't wealthy, he had the privilege of an education in Mediolanum, modern Milan. Most of his middle years were spent in the midst of a vast civil war, especially between Caesar and Pompey, and then between Octavian and Antony. After Octavian triumphed and became the first emperor, Augustus, Virgil moved to Rome and wrote a series of poems, mostly about beautiful nature and productive agriculture, that served as a metaphor for the good things brought about by the new ruler.
And Augustus liked these works so much that he commissions Virgil to write an epic to rival that of the Homeric epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, written 700 years earlier. And Virgil sets out to do just that from 29 BC to 19 BC. And towards the end of his life, he decides to actually go visit Greece, the homeland of Homer, to kind of see where this came from, right? And he ends up dying on the way back. And the Aeneid is still unfinished, and he kind of had written down that he'd like the whole thing burned because it wasn't ready yet. But Augustus reads through what he has, and he thinks it's awesome. And so he publishes it anyway, and it's a huge, huge hit.
But it wasn't the Roman poet Virgil who invented the character Aeneas. Instead, he goes way back to the earliest days of Greek literature, mentioned in both the Iliad and in the Homeric hymns. The Homeric hymn of Aphrodite tells of the birth of Aeneas. His father, the mortal man Anchises, has become the love interest of Aphrodite, goddess of love. They make love, and she becomes pregnant. And even though Anchises is blinded by Zeus for bragging about his relationship with the goddess of love, Aphrodite gives birth to his son, the hero Aeneas.
So from the start, Aeneas is a hero because of his semi-divine birth, right? His mom is Aphrodite or Venus. And one of the cool things is that later Roman rulers kind of draw upon this lineage to hint that they too are at least a little bit divine. And in particular, this comes from Aeneas' son Iulus, who is seen as the progenitor of the Julian clan, the Julian family in Rome. And so Julius Caesar traces his lineage back to the Julian family, which in turn goes back to Iulus, right? in turn to Aeneas, and then his mom, Venus. And so we can see on this statue here, right, of Augustus, Caesar's adopted heir, that he's got little Cupid right next to him, right? And that Cupid, the son of Venus, is a not so subtle hint that he too has some divine lineage.
When Aeneas grows up, he joins the Trojans in the fight against the Achaeans. In fact, he's second cousins with the Trojan hero Hector. And even though Aeneas doesn't feature prominently in the fighting, he's consistently aided by the gods. Aphrodite protects him in battle, Apollo rescues him from Diomedes, and Poseidon helps him against Achilles. But of course in the end, the gods couldn't prevent a Greek victory, and Troy burned from the inside out.
But Aeneas didn't die in the burning of Troy. Instead, he escapes, and the classic image of this is him running away with the sword of Troy in one hand, with his dad Anchises on his back, and his son Ascanius or Iulus kind of hanging on his leg. And this becomes one of the kind of most popular depictions of Aeneas in later art, the flight from burning Troy.
Virgil took his inspiration, Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, quite seriously. And the Aeneid itself can be viewed as a combination of these two epics. Books 1 to 6 tell the tale of Aeneas' journey from burning Troy to the shores of Italy, and of course the trials and tribulations that occurred along the way. And this is basically the plot of the Odyssey. Books 7 to 12, as we'll see, tell the story of Aeneas' military battles in Italy, a convenient parallel plot to Homer's Iliad.
So the story all begins with Juno's anger. And she's still upset with the Trojans because Paris chose Aphrodite to give the golden apple to. And she's especially angry at Aeneas, right? Because his mom is Venus or Aphrodite. And so as Aeneas is traveling back through the Mediterranean to try to get to Italy, Juno blows his ship off course. Now luckily Neptune, right, god of the sea, is a little upset that Juno's kind of intruding on his territory. So he calms things down and allows Aeneas' ship to land on safe shores. And it just so happens these are on the shores of Carthage, the newly founded city, and their queen, Dido.
As he tells the tale of the burning of Troy, his flight across the Mediterranean, and his failed attempts at founding a new place to live, Dido is falling madly in love with him. And he's falling for her too. I guess that happens when your mom is the goddess of love. But it wasn't to last, and Jupiter reminds Aeneas his destiny lies in Italy. And as he departs, Queen Dido is unconsolable. She builds a funerary pyre, stabs herself, and then burns herself to death. And with the last words, she curses Aeneas. The people of Italy will always be the enemies of the Carthaginians.
And so we have an explanation for the Punic Wars, one of Rome's greatest set of wars between Rome and Carthage during the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE. Now this is happening 1,000 years later compared to Aeneas' time, but actually a couple hundred years earlier compared to Virgil's time. And after fleeing from Carthage, right, Aeneas eventually lands on the shores of Italy at the site of Cumae, and there he meets the Sibyl, a prophetess. And she says he has to descend into the underworld. And as he does so, he meets his dad Anchises down there. And his dad tells him about the glory that Rome will become. It'll become a mighty people, a mighty empire. And so he continues on his way to find the right place in Italy to found the race of people that will eventually become Rome.
Eventually, Aeneas makes it to his destined land, Latium, home of the Latins and ruled by King Latinus. Things start out here really well, but they too eventually go bad. Quite bad for the rest of the epic. And the battles that ensue are very frequently compared to the war between the Achaeans and the Trojans in Homer's Iliad.
So it all starts really well. Aeneas lands on Italian shores, and the local king, King Latinus, we get the word Latin from him. He's going to give his daughter Lavinia to Aeneas in marriage. Now, that sounds great, but now Juno gets involved once again. And she convinces the queen that her daughter is not meant for Aeneas, but rather for another local ruler, King Turnus of the Rutuli. And so you can imagine that one woman being engaged to two different men. Well, that's not going to end well.
Aeneas responds by allying with local tribes who had previous conflicts with the Rutuli. An epic battle ensues, truly a Roman-Trojan war. And the deaths that occur during this battle are some of the most emotional parts of the story. During the battle, Aeneas' new best friend Pallas, the son of his ally King Evander, is killed, reminiscent of the death of Patroclus, Achilles' best friend from the Iliad.
And the war rages on and on and on, and there's all sorts of death and destruction. And you get really emotionally invested in the characters, but then they're dying all over the place. And eventually, Aeneas and King Turnus, they decide in one-on-one combat to settle this once and for all. And at first, Turnus has the upper hand, and he lifts a massive boulder with which he's going to crush poor Aeneas. But at the last moment, the gods turn against him, and his strength leaves him. And Aeneas stabs him in the leg, and he goes down to one knee. And now Turnus is begging for mercy from Aeneas. But there's no mercy to be had. Aeneas slays King Turnus, secures his place in Italy, and becomes the progenitor of the race of people who will one day become the Roman Empire.
The function of the Aeneid goes far beyond just telling a good tale. First and foremost, it's used to justify Julius Caesar and his adopted son Octavian, later known as Augustus. And they need legitimization since they're the first sole rulers of Rome in approximately 500 years. Aeneas' son was called Ascanius, but also known as Ilus or Iulus after Ilium, another name for Troy. And he's the progenitor of the Julian family in Rome, which just happens to be the clan that Julius Caesar comes from.
Now this connects Julius Caesar back to Iulus, back to Aeneas, whose mom is Venus. And then Augustus, right? His adopted dad is Julius Caesar. And so through this kind of semi-divine lineage, Augustus is gaining political legitimization. And this is really important for him because he didn't come to power naturally, right? He came to power militarily, defeating his enemies in battle, not through a smooth transfer of power from his dad, who also was a king, whose dad was also a king, that sort of way.
In addition to legitimizing political power, the Aeneid also sets a new moral program for how the people in Rome should behave. Moral failings were one of the main reasons put forth for the fall of the Roman Republic, so they needed to portray Augustus as a restorer of virtue. The bonds developed in war against Turnus, for example, represent how to build strong relationships for Roman youth. Aeneas is also extremely pious. Whereas he might want to settle with Dido forever, he abandons her to fulfill his duty and destiny, a prime example of placing duty to the gods and to the state above your own desires. Turnus, on the other hand, is essentially the opposite of this, representing rage and irrationality and ignoring the gods.
Now, in the end, most people don't quite consider the Aeneid at the same level as the Iliad or Odyssey. But the kind of nuanced emotions of the characters and the complex politics of the text itself within ancient Roman society, well, those things have made the Aeneid one of the kind of most influential works in Western literature from antiquity to the present day. So the Romans needed two things. They needed to legitimize the new emperor, and they needed something culturally to compete with the great works of Greek literature. And the Aeneid does both of these things. It portrays Augustus in a really good light, and it's an amazing tale on its own. So when you read ancient literature, keep in mind there may be more to it than just the surface level. Just a few things you can take away from the Aeneid, epic of ancient Rome.